Chapter 18. Before they took another step, Nika heard the unmistakable bong of an aluminum boat hitting rock. Thomas reached out his hand for her to be still, and the two of them inched up the shore toward the sound. They slipped into the bushes behind the eagle tree and carefully parted dense branches to peek through. Bristow was swearing and muttering as he clumsily tugged his boat over a piece of driftwood. He fumbled and leaned forward, pulling a rifle from the seat. Electric fear shot through Nika's body. She scrambled back across the ledge and ran, her feet tangling and tripping in knots of weeds and brush, propelled by her own racing blood. Thomas was right behind her. At the small clearing by the chair tree, they looked up the hill, frantic to see Luna. In patchwork shadow, she was peering from several feet beyond the edge of the woods. Her light face barely visible. She turned her head and looked toward the eagle tree. Her ears were airplaned to the side, uncertain, her body motionless. What could they do? They'd heard Bristow say he would kill the runaway wolf if he could ever find her. Had he followed them? If we get the wolf to come to us, Bristow wouldn't dare shoot, said Thomas. Come on, Luna, Nika called, kneeling and puppy whining, trying to keep the urgency from her voice so she wouldn't scare the wolf. She puppy whined again. When Luna didn't come toward them, Thomas dug into his pack and produced a piece of jerky, holding it out. One of Luna's ears stood taller. The other still pulled partway back in fear. She began to move toward Nika and Thomas in a crouch, shooting glances toward the clunking noises from Bristow's boat. She circled around behind them and flattened herself in a cover of bushy junipers. Thomas tossed her a chunk of the jerky. She took it in her mouth, then dropped it. Nika crooned, "Good girl, Luna, good girl. You can do it. Stay with us. Come on, Luna." Nika and Thomas both realized at the same moment that there was no going home now. The sky was burly with purple clouds, and they could hear the collisions of thunder coming closer. Thomas tried to lure Luna with another small piece of jerky. Like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood all mixed up, this time they were dropping crumbs for the wolf. Luna moved closer to them, but kept her eyes and ears trained on the muffled scraping behind the eagle tree. She growled, raised her hackles, trotted in a circle, and then froze and sank into the junipers again. Nika heard a thud and saw the bushes shake beneath the eagle tree. Luna heard it too and tensed. She crouched. Then Nika and Thomas heard Bristow moving through the trees and swearing. The wolf pup ran up the rock, heading for safety, but Bristow had cut uphill and was coming out near the feeding spot. Luna froze. Nika and Thomas saw Bristow at the edge of the trees, staring at the crouched wolf. He laughed and then raised his rifle. There was a snapping sound, like a large branch breaking in the wind, followed by a yelp of pain. Nika yelled and ran across the rock toward the man. She didn't think and didn't care. Thomas shouted, "Nika, don't!" But Nika was screaming at Bristow, "Stop! Stop! I'll get my uncle! You'll go to jail!" Halfway across the rock ledge, she tripped. Her foot jammed between the rocks. Pain spiked up through her ankle. Panic dulled the pain, and she hobbled on. She couldn't see Luna. When she came around a giant boulder, she saw Bristow staggering toward the wolf with his rifle pointed down. He stopped to maintain his balance, one hand on a stump. Luna was on the ground past the boulder at the edge of some small trees. She was bleeding from a wound in her shoulder, her head partly raised. Bristow was cursing and swaying. Nika ran to Luna and fell to her knees beside her, screaming at Bristow, "This is what you wanted. Get out of here. You going to shoot kids too?" "You didn't see nothing," shouted Bristow, breathing heavily. "I bet you're the one who let the others go, so I got nothing. Stupid bleeding heart kids." Bristow turned and walked haltingly away. At that moment the wind died and the lake went completely still. After a snarl of engine noise and swearing, Nika heard the boat putter away from the island. Luna wasn't moving much, but she panted and made low-pitched puppy whines. Nika felt a sharp wave of pain from her own ankle. She slumped down next to the beautiful tan wolf. Across the lake, yellow wires of light cut through the navy blue sky, followed by a grumble of thunder. Inside, Nika felt her courage collapse. Luna could die. Maybe Bristow had found her because of them. She jabbed at her tears with the back of her hand. Then, taking a breath, she yelled, "Thomas!" Thomas came scrambling up with his backpack, his face frozen in fear, his mouth gaping as he stared at the downed wolf. "I thought he shot you." He quickly seemed to collect himself. "We'll get to the vet. Touch her. Go slowly," he said. Nika reached out and carefully lowered her hand onto the thick fur on the wolf's shoulder. Her hand came away bloody. Luna lifted her nose and then let her head drop down again. "Good. Now see if you can find the wound and press to stop the bleeding." Nika found a wet hole in Luna's bloody shoulder and pinched it together with her fingers. The wolf moaned and jerked, then looked away as though she'd given up. The wolf's breathing seemed to steady, and Nika started to breathe with her, feeling a strange calm. She thought about Ian, how much she needed him right now. The wind was picking up. Thomas looked at the sky again. "The storm's going to hit. I can just make it to town. You stay here. You're going to get pretty wet." "Wait a sec. Hang on." Thomas flew down to his boat and came back with a life jacket and a boat cushion. "For insulation from the ground," he said. Then he attacked some nearby trees with a knife he always carried. He came back with armloads of branches that he began to teepee around and over her and the wolf. As the balsam branches began to surround her, Nika was grateful that Luna had fallen next to a dense stand of trees on bushy ground. She remembered hearing you didn't want to be next to a tall tree or a big rock in a lightning storm. Thomas poked his head into the ragged shelter he'd thrown up around them. "When the lightning starts, if your hair stands on end, squat on the life jacket with your head between your knees." She heard the scraping of his boots as he scrambled down to the boat. At least it was still light out. The engine started right away, and she heard his small boat move out onto the lake, thumping as it bucked the waves. She was glad it wasn't far to Red Pine. The rain fell softly at first and then increased to a rhythm of heavy drops plunked against the rocks and leaves. In the distance, she could barely hear the drone of Thomas's boat. Adjusting the branches, Nika laid the life jacket and cushion so that she could circle her body around Luna. As rain trickled down her face, she positioned her arm over the wolf, pressing the wound. Soon she was soaked through, shivering, and her ankle throbbed with pain. Thunder tumbled, dark sounds ripped by stabs of lightning. The storm lowered around them like a sudden fall of early night. Nika wondered what time it had been when Thomas left. She wished she'd worn a watch. She tried to remember when Ian said he was going to be home today. Had he already left town? If so, who would Thomas find to help? Spikes of lightning, explosions of thunder, wind pushing trees in dizzy circles, and slanting sheets of water all surrounded Nika and the unconscious wolf. She tried to think of something else beside her fear and the pulsing pain in her ankle. Something besides how Luna might die because of them. She thought of her old dog friend, Rookie, and his knowing brown eyes. Once she had been with her mom in the mountains in a cabin, and both she and Randall had been afraid of the thunder and lightning. Her mom had made up a story about the Thunder Princess, how she had big feet and how she made thunder when her enormous boots pounded across the sky. Nika imagined her mom cuddled up next to her now, telling the story. Time seemed to crawl on its belly. Nika couldn't stop worrying. She had to do something to pass the eternity until someone came. She tried reciting nursery rhymes, starting with "There was an old woman tossed up in a basket," but she couldn't remember all of the words. Then she tried to remember her lines from the school play last year. She said the alphabet with an animal for each letter. Aardvark was her favorite. She bogged down N with N and ended up singing Girl Scout songs. Finally, she just sat in the dark, clutching the green jade of the necklace Olivia had made. When the heavy rain began to let up, Nika could see the lake again. Sunset threw fingers of yellow in the fans above the leftover hunching thunderclouds. It had been a hot day before the storm, but now the temperature had dropped. She worried about Luna being cold. She remembered that when a person was injured, you were supposed to keep him warm. The wolf was unresponsive, but Nika could feel a pulse. Shivering, she put as much of her body as she could next to the wolf for warmth. At least she could feel the soft rise and fall of the wolf's breathing under her hand. "Good girl, Luna. Good girl," she said. Nika remembered all the lonely waiting she'd experienced in her life, wondering what would happen next. And here she was waiting again, cold and soaking wet. After the sun went down, she couldn't even see beyond her foot in the storm-swept, moonless night. What if Thomas's boat had broken down? If so, the only person who knew she was here was Bristow. Finally, she heard outboard motors, then a man's voice and aluminum clunks from the landing. Soon, thin bars of light were breaking and zigzagging through the trees. She shivered even more. Even her jaw was shaking. What if it was Bristow? Finally, she heard low voices and one higher one. Bristow would have been alone. They're up the hill a little over here. It was Thomas. In a moment, shafts of light from 4 flashing flashlights pinned the balsam tent. She heard the squishing of wet boots. Then Thomas, Ian, Maki, and Eleanor all emerged. As Thomas removed the branches, no one spoke. Maki propped a large flashlight in the crotch of a tree to light the scene. "We got a little wet," was all Nika managed to say through chattering teeth. The 3 adults in their rain slickers looked down at the sodden pair. Eleanor and Maki gently squatted by the wolf. Ian stood holding his flashlight, shaking his head, then went to his knees next to Nika. "Are you okay?" he asked. "My ankle," she answered in a shaky voice. Now that they were here, she felt warm tears on her cold cheeks and her nose was running. Ian gently flexed and probed her ankle, saying, "Does this hurt? How about this?" His voice was steady as it had been when he'd examined the dead wolf earlier in the summer. Very professional. "Well, I don't think it's broken, but we need to get you home." Then he turned to Luna, and with the same calm quickly assessed the wound in her shoulder. The wolf seemed to be barely breathing. "I somehow can't believe what I'm seeing." He stood and looked off toward the boats. Thomas explained he thought this wolf came from Bristow, and you two tried to stop him. He shook his head, wiping his face with his sleeve. She wished she could see his expression. She couldn't tell if he was proud of her, scared, or mad. "Before he shot her, she came to us," Nika declared, trying to sound bright and brave, even though she wasn't sure she was strong enough to even stand. "She's got to be okay." Thomas stood behind Ian. Nika tried to force her shivering lips into a smile of gratitude. Ian spoke to Eleanor and Maki. "We've got to hurry. Nika is pretty cold. And the wolf." Ian helped Nika stand on one leg, then swept her up onto his shoulder. "This okay?" he asked. "Hold on. It's called a fireman's carry." Upside down, Nika craned her neck to see Eleanor, Maki, and Thomas lift Luna onto some kind of canvas sling. Luna didn't move. Nika took this as a bad sign. Struggling to stay on their feet was making a bizarre parade. Flashlights slicing through the darkness, they carried the full-grown wolf across the wet rocks to where the boats were tied. After Maki and Eleanor loaded their canvas burden into Maki's boat, Thomas hopped in and sat by Luna, his hand keeping pressure on the wound. "Go ahead and take the wolf to Dave," Ian shouted. Maki nodded. He and Eleanor pushed off and climbed in. The motor started, then accelerated to an urgent-sounding high-pitched hum as they headed toward town. Ian helped Nika across the rocks to his larger boat. Drops of water fell from the soaked trees and waves sloshed against the shore. To keep her balance, Nika held tight to the gunwales of the boat until Ian came to lift her over the side. She hopped up over the chair next to his in the front. Waiting, Ian maneuvered the boat past the rocks, jumped over the side, started the big engine, turned on the running lights, and set out into the uneasy water. Nika couldn't believe he knew where he was going in the dark. To her, it felt like being inside a windy tunnel. But when she saw the lights of red pine, she realized they'd rounded the far edge of Eagle Island. The lights faded as they headed out into the murky lake. She felt lost as they tossed across the waves created by the storm. The powerful boat pounded the water, jarring her teeth. Her ankles shouted out with pain each time the boat hit the bottom of the trough. It wasn't long before she saw the familiar pattern of lights in Ian's cabin by the beach. They were home. The tan wolf woke in another cage, and there was pain in her shoulder. She fell in and out of fitful sleep. The cage was small, and there was no place to hide. A man moved slowly, talked calmly, and put something smelly on her wound. And that is the end of chapter 18.